Our next speaker is Dr. Claire Jardine, the Regional Director, Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative Ontario / Nunavut, and she's here to speak to us today about the avian influenza in wild bird populations. Thank you so much for coming today, Claire, and I'll just let you know you are still on mute before you get started, but you're here to tell us all the things that we need to hear and yet we're hesitant to listen to. So I thank you for sharing with us.
Great, thanks very much, Charlotte. Can you see the presentation okay? Great, awesome. Well, thanks everybody, and I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in today's producer update. It's really great to be here. And as Charlotte mentioned, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about avian influenza in wild birds. Now, I'm sure you are all, there we go, all well aware of the recent detections of highly pathogenic avian influenza in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia and in 5 US states, and the detection of avian influenza in wild birds in locations in Atlantic Canada and the US as well. So all these detections have led OMAFRA to release a veterinary advisory calling for the implementation of strict biosecurity measures, and that's going to be really key for protecting the poultry industry. And I'm going to leave that with the experts that are coming up today to talk about that. But what I wanted to do is talk to you a little bit about avian influenza, just broadly speaking, and so give you a bit of information about avian influenza and the situation in wild birds, and tell you about some of the work that we're doing in terms of wild bird surveillance in Ontario. So we know that, you know already, avian influenza is the disease caused by influenza type A viruses. The avian influenza viruses are divided into subtypes on the basis of their surface proteins, hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. There are 18 known hemagglutinin subtypes and 11 known neuraminidase subtypes. And this is important because this is how we identify the viruses. So right now we're dealing with an H5N1. So it just means we have the hemagglutinin is number 5 and the neuraminidase is number 1, and they've come together to form this subtype that we're dealing with. Now, it's important to note that wild birds are the natural host for most influenza type A viruses. There's just a couple other things that I wanted to mention about influenza viruses. So based on their molecular characteristics and their ability to cause disease and mortality in chickens and in a lab setting, there's low pathogenic strains and then these highly pathogenic strains. And most of the highly pathogenic avian influenza viruses have contained that H5 or H7 hemagglutinin. And so those are the ones that we really focus on for our surveillance. And the other way that we characterize influenza viruses is through lineages. And there's just 2 broad lineages, this Eurasian lineage and North American lineage. And so what we're dealing with right now in North America is a highly pathogenic avian influenza Eurasian lineage H5N1 virus. And so you may be wondering, since it's a Eurasian lineage, how it got here. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, there's been an ongoing outbreak of this particular virus in Europe and parts of Asia since, for quite a while now, but this figure here sort of shows from October 2021. And you can see these aren't all wild birds, or wild birds and poultry, but this is H5N1 occurring in Europe last fall. And it's likely that the virus came over to North America via a wild bird that was infected. And we don't usually expect to find high path EI circulating in wild birds, but that's thought to be the case in this particular situation. So now that it's here, there is the possibility, and we're starting to see it already, of this cross-continental spread. Now, migratory birds, these waterfowl tend to use these flyways, and they're often depicted as these very sort of hard cut off routes. So we've got the Pacific Flyway, Central Flyway, Mississippi Flyway, and the Atlantic Flyway. But and that's shown on the left. And we think about it that way, but in reality, this figure on the right shows that birds are moving across these different flyways. So we've got birds that are mixing, depending on the timing of the migration. So, and I've got this figure, this next figure that kind of illustrates that even more, I think. So this shows dabbling duck movements to and from North and South Carolina. And the color intensities represent the sort of number of movements from those states. And the majority of birds do move along the Atlantic flyway, but you can clearly see that there's spread and potential for spread, into the Mississippi and even into the Central Flyway based on these movement data. And I just want to take a moment of your time to kind of talk a little bit about the ecology of avian influenza viruses. So we know that wild birds are the reservoir for avian influenza in nature. And we typically see low, when we see incursions into poultry, it's typically associated with low pathogenic strains getting into poultry. And then within the poultry industry or on poultry farms, the viruses adapt and mutate and change, and they become highly pathogenic. And then we see these mortality events occurring in poultry with occasional incursions of high path strains back into wild birds. So that's sort of the typical situation. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute. And I also want to mention, if you look at this slide, I wanted to just mention the zoonotic potential of avian influenza. So humans that have had close contact with infected birds or contaminated environments are at risk, and we need to be careful when we're dealing and handling with infected birds. So one of the things you may notice in this figure is we don't see mortality depicted in wild birds, or they don't seem to get sick. And that's sort of the typical view of avian influenza, right? That wild birds carry it, and then when it gets into poultry, we see disease. But since about 2002, that's really been changing, and we have been seeing increased mortality and disease reporting in wild birds. And that seems to be particularly associated with this Eurasian high path H5N1 in Europe and Asia over this past fall period. We have seen more mortality events in wild birds. And I'm just gonna, in the next slide, show you a picture here. They estimate that this is a die-off of wild cranes in Israel, and they've estimated that about 5,000 birds died over a relatively short period of time last fall. And this picture just shows all the dead cranes, and some are still alive, but many dead or sick cranes out in the water, and some workers going to pick up these birds. So what we're seeing now are wild birds are actually becoming kind of another victim of highly pathogenic avian influenza viruses. So if we revisit this figure, so in addition to wild birds acting as kind of the reservoir for most, most avian influenza viruses, just in general, they're sort of acting as asymptomatic carriers. We're also now seeing mortality events. So we're seeing birds die from avian influenza as well. And there seems to be ongoing bidirectional exchange between wild birds and domestic birds after introduction from poultry. And we're seeing die-offs in not just water birds, but other species as well. Scavenger birds and occasionally mammals have been reported dying in Europe as well. And just to return back to that zoonotic potential, there has been a recent case of infection in the UK in a human that had close contact with domestic ducks that were infected. And so I just want to revisit this. The ecology of the disease seems to be a little bit different with this highly pathogenic avian influenza that we're dealing with right now. And what I think this does, I hope, is kind of illustrate the need for a One Health approach to dealing with this outbreak. And I think what we need to do is really ensure appropriate attention to human, animal, environmental health, and we really need to ensure that there's good coordination among the different agencies. We need to raise awareness and make sure people know to report birds, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And we need to maintain this intensified surveillance and biosecurity measures. And I just want to, I'll leave the biosecurity, the details to the experts, but I just wanted to mention that it's really important to prevent contact between your birds and other domesticated birds or wild birds, but also contaminated equipment. We mustn't forget that component, and people and water sources. That's really important. And I think, from my perspective, it's also really important that biosecurity efforts should prevent the spread of infection from infected poultry back to wild birds, because it just helps to perpetuate this cycle, which we're trying to stop. Okay. And there's no real benefit to be gained. People, often like, why can't we do anything in wild birds? And there's actually, the major animal health organizations agree that there's no benefit to be gained in attempting to control the virus in wild birds through culling or habitat destruction. disease control measures shouldn't include killing wild birds, spraying chemicals, or affecting wetland or other habitats. And in fact, there's evidence to show that high levels of protection of wetlands have been found to reduce highly pathogenic avian influenza risk, keeping birds away from production facilities. Okay. So what we can do, though, in terms of wild birds, is try to detect things promptly so that we can reduce the risk of cross-species transmission to poultry. So that's our goal. So early detection in wild birds can help inform producers and allow you to better protect your flocks. And so the way we do this is we have swabs that we collect, and this picture shows here, this is a swab in the oral cavity of I think that's an eagle in this particular case. These get submitted to the provincial diagnostic lab, and any samples that are H5 or H7 positive or inconclusive provincially are sent to the National Center for Foreign Animal Disease for confirmation and identification. So how do we get these swabs? There's two main ways, and I'll start with live bird surveillance. So the Canadian Wildlife Service and the Ontario Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources and Forestry are conducting opportunistic live bird surveillance. It's primarily focused on waterfowl. And you can see in the table on the right some of the results. So there is live bird surveillance occurring in Ontario, but the results aren't posted yet. But you can see surveillance occurring in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland there. And I know I can see this 70 under H5 for Nova Scotia. It's very high, but I looked into that a little bit, and they were all collected from a single site, so perhaps not as alarming as it might seem. So in addition to our live bird surveillance, if you see a dead bird, please get in touch with us at the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative. We conduct dead bird surveillance. Our targets are, we do all water birds, so whether they've died of influenza or not, they will be, or whether we think they've died of influenza or not, they will be tested because we're concerned about those asymptomatic carriers. We want to detect it in those birds as well. We'll also test scavenger birds like crows and ravens, raptors, any die-off. We'll test birds that are involved in a die-off event of any species, and then birds that are showing neurological signs. So things like, swimming or walking in circles, tremors, abnormal gait, anything like that. If they've seen those signs prior to death, they will be tested. And the results of these tests are available on our website, and they're updated bi-weekly. So you'll be able to keep track of that. And I just put in this picture to show our pathologist at the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative, Brian Stevens, examining a gull, and he'll be doing a avian influenza swab on that gull as well. And I put some example results here. So far, well, this is a bit old now, but in Ontario at this time, we had tested 11 and hadn't detected any. And of course, now we're trying to ramp up this surveillance as migration starts. So we'll be, we'll be ramping up this surveillance and trying to get those numbers up. Okay, and I also wanted to mention that this type of surveillance is also occurring in the US. And this, just to give you an example, this is some of the surveillance being done in hunter harvested and live birds in the US. So these birds would not be sick, but they have detected this Eurasian lineage of H5 virus. So it is, there's a lot of surveillance across Canada, surveillance in the US. And I think, I guess with the next slide, I just wanted to end just by saying that we are currently at high risk for the incursion of highly pathogenic avian influenza Eurasian lineage H5N1. It's around us geographically, and we're also at a time of the year when we're expecting sort of peak dabbling duck migrations probably in early March. So we really need to ensure that we have enhanced surveillance and biosecurity. That's going to be the key to protecting both poultry and also wild birds. And it really is going to require a One Health approach with a collaborative effort with our colleagues in the in environment and in wildlife health, agriculture, and also ministries of health at both the provincial, territorial, and federal levels. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. Now I will just toss out the fact that there was a question come in. Al Dam actually jumped all over it, but it was about that reporting of I've seen a dead bird and what do I do next? So he's tossed in the phone number into the Q&A as well. And I think
Perfect.
one more time. But thank you again, Claire, for kind of hitting home the fact that not, 70 confirmed cases in Newfoundland seems very shocking, but when you find out it's from one location, it makes a little more sense.
Yeah,
Or Nova Scotia, sorry, not Newfoundland. But it is, definitely we're keeping our eyes on the situation, and we'll remember to hit the website and keep up to date. Um,
great.
I do thank you. Kind of picking up right where you left off. Our next speaker is going to go on, and Dr. Andrea Osborn, who's the Senior Veterinary Science Specialist of Animal Health Science Directorate from Canadian Food Inspection Agency, is going to tell us about a report that you can continue to watch to know about the emerging disease. So the Community for Emerging and Zoonotic Diseases, CEZD, is the acronym that we all seem to know and love. And thank you again, Andrea, for speaking with us today. I'll let you take over.
Great, thank you, Charlotte. And I'm just going to share my screen. I will share the whole thing, and hopefully, can you see that?
Looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for asking me to come today. I'm glad to have the opportunity, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Community for Emerging and Zoonotic Diseases. A little bit of what it is, why it was developed, how it works, and then I'm going to be a little bit of a broken record with Dr. Jardine on HighPath AI, and we have some of the same images, so I will cut that part a little bit short because you've heard some of that story already. What is CEZD? It's a virtual multidisciplinary network, and we use a combination of automated information mining and multidisciplinary member perspectives to provide early warning notifications for emerging and zoonotic diseases. And we also facilitate any further discussion, analysis, and reporting as needed for relevant signals. So we're really a combination of this technology and the human network together to give early warning. We're very, very broad. And I'll tell you a little bit about that when we get to the community side of things. So CEZD was developed to support Canada's early warning, preparedness, and response capabilities, specifically for emerging animal diseases and zoonotic diseases. And here's how it works. That technology filters information from public sources, trusted public sources. Because there's such a vast amount of information out there, we use that technology to bring information in to the human network. And that human network is broad and has people from animal health, public health, environmental health in both public sectors and the private sector, academia, industry, and then various networks. Those individuals rate the signals that are coming in for their relevance to Canada. Then our core team identifies the critical signals, and those are shared every week in a weekly intelligence report that I will give you the link to, and you can sign up for it if you want at the end of this. Occasionally, we do additional evaluation depending on the situation. So that's basically how CEZD works. The technology we use is provided for us by the Public Health Agency of Canada, and it's called Kiwi, or Knowledge Integration Using Web-Based Intelligence Technology. And we use automated searching of 21 trusted sources and manual searching of an additional 10. There is a lot of, I'll say, garbage out there. We have to be cautious in the information put forward because of misinformation and disinformation. So we focus our evaluations on those sources before they go through the algorithm. And that algorithm's job is to filter out the noise. And that way the analysts can focus on the most important signals to take forward to the broader community. This is an image of our network and the members of CEZD. There's a total of 470 total. About 200 are represented in this diagram that are active. The rest are passive, just receiving the intelligence report. We're quite heavy in federal and provincial government members in animal health and public health. We're a little weak on environmental health. We do have industry members. We have, I'm sure Tom Baker, if he's not on the call with the Featherboard Command Center, does a phenomenal job of information distribution around poultry here in Ontario. And the Chicken Farmers of Canada, we also have Chicken Farmers of Ontario that receive our reports. So we have a good industry representation. We actually have medical community reps, so Sunnybrook Health Sciences and our diagnostic labs, and numerous academic partners as well. One of the places where our messages can be used most usefully is with networks. And we're a member of the Canadian Animal Health Surveillance System. I actually chair the Canadian Animal Health Surveillance System Poultry Network. And then we have connections to the Ontario Animal Health Network, RASO, and a number of other networks, CWHC as well. So those reports go out and they raise awareness across disciplines, which is really, really important. As Dr. Jardine had said, this has to be a One Health approach with these type of diseases. Our identification process is very effective. And so if you look at our last fiscal year, there were about just under 38,000 signals or information pieces, they're called in the system, received. And the algorithm got rid of 30,000 of those, over 30,000 of those. And so what that means is that the analysts only need to look at about 120 a week, which is really not that many to filter through. Then we reported out the 252 that were relevant to Canada. And those go into our weekly intelligence report. What you can see, this is last week's report, actually 2 weeks ago, where you can actually see, the high path AI situation in Canada and the US, also talking about rabies in the north, as well as Newfoundland and Labrador. This report is distributed weekly to all of our members. It's also posted on our website and distributed on Twitter. So this is open to everybody, and you're certainly welcome to receive that. So I'm going to just go on and talk a little bit about high path AI and what we've been monitoring, just to give you an example of the kind of reports and information that's available as things are going on. So when you look at the number of signals that have been reported, and I'm just going back 5 years to 2017, everything after the last European event was pretty calm, spring, fall, and these migrations and the total number of things that are getting reported publicly were fairly background levels. It was in the fall of 2020 that we really raised this red flag and said something is different here. And since then, there was a little bit of a peak, but now it has just gone through the roof. And so this was really the time where we started saying, we got to watch this. And in the last wave in 2020 to 2021, those levels were elevated. And that started in August of 2020 when those H5N8 signals from Russia in wild and farmed birds started to happen. In the fall, there was a really rapid increase in cases from both Europe and Asia in both wild and farm birds. And that's when we started to see some really high mortality rates, unusual species affected, and in particular, India, there was big crow mortalities, which was something we weren't really that used to seeing in these signals. There were recombinations that happened during that year. And when you go to the summary, this chart is from October 2020 to September 2021. So that's the previous wave than what we're experiencing now. And all of these pink dots are H5N8. And just in Europe, in this little cluster, well, it's not that little, it was over 3,700 events reported. And that meant 23 million poultry died or were culled in 31 countries. And so this was really a huge event for Europe, and it really has not backed up. It's also throughout Asia as well. And like Dr. Jardine said, it's that Eurasian strain that is involved. And this is the same image that Dr. Jardine used, and this is the current wave where H5N1 is predominating. It has very, very high mortality rates on farm. So 80 to 90% of those birds are dead very, very quickly. And it is, the strange thing is that it's also those wild and farmed populations, which is an unusual presentation again. So I will be a little bit of a broken record. We know this, you've seen this. There's been farm birds both in Canada and the US. And this actually this morning has gone up by one. So there's 5 different groups now. I believe in Indiana, they've just reported some more. It is backyard flocks as well as commercial flocks happening across the US, across North America. CWHC is the best source for wild bird information cases across Atlantic Canada. And in the US, there are quite a number of reports, particularly in dabbling ducks. And like Claire said, in dabbling ducks in particular, those are hunter-caught birds that are not actually sick. And they are, same image, coming across the country. It doesn't really matter which flyway they're in. And so this information basically tells you that this is our early warning and that this is something to be absolutely prepared for. And I won't talk about it any more than that because you heard it already. So really my take home message is that these diseases, the emerging animal diseases and zoonotic diseases, are being monitored and reported on routinely. CEZD is very, very broad. So avian influenza is one thing we're monitoring, but we're looking at African swine fever, we're looking at COVID, we're looking at, other influenzas, swine influenzas, and reporting out routinely on those. Those weekly intelligence reports are available to everybody, and the reports are posted on our website weekly. Or if you wanted to get them emailed to you, you should just contact us to be put on the distribution list. But that information is very, very available to you should you want to receive it. And with that, I will stop. Back to you, Charlotte.
Thank you so much, Andrea. We do have 2 questions pop in, and I'm going to start with the first one, although I'm not sure that it's really one that you're going to be able to answer for us. This one was there any disease issue with the birds that were literally falling out of the sky in Mexico a couple of weeks ago?
So I haven't seen any diagnosis on those particular cases. We have had a lot, and over the last, there's been quite a lot of bird mortality in the last couple years. There was a big crow mortality event in PEI. There were songbird deaths across the US. The songbirds we never got an answer on. The crows in PEI, I believe, was reovirus. But, no, we don't always get an answer. And so I don't have an answer on that one, I'm afraid. I don't know, Claire, if you do, if you'd heard about that or seen anything.
I heard about it, and I don't have an answer. I'm not sure. I haven't heard about any diagnostic workup that's been done, but one of the things that I just read about it. So just, I'm not sure that it's a great source of information, but sometimes with these birds that are flocking, if a predator comes down, they're speculating that it's related to a predation event. They've come down and they've hit the ground and kind of had this mass mortality event. That's based on people looking at the behavior, the videos that there was a lot of videos, I think, and looking at the behavior of the birds and how they reacted. Although there's no, they mentioned that there's no predator in the video, but that was sort of a speculation. But you can't rule out other things like toxins or other diseases at this point, at least as far as I'm aware. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you both for jumping back in. Ironic that we had you both available for this. So at this time, I guess there isn't really a confirmed reason. I do have one more question for you, and it's asking, is the amount of avian influenza across Europe and the world at this point, has there been any zoonosis happening that we're aware of?
So it's a really good question. There was one case of the H5N1 in a woman that in the UK that had a mild illness associated with close contact with ducks. There are a number of cases. This one is actually quite interesting because it's not zoonotic, but species jump. There have been foxes, there have been seals, there have been polecats. There's been a number of species that have got this H5N1, and it's interesting. In the foxes, it's been neurological instead of a respiratory disease, and so it's this is starting to show a few more signs of mammalian adaptation. the receptors still don't look very mammalian adapted according to the scientists. So I think it's still a possibility. And the thing that makes me a little nervous is the sheer amount of virus that's present. There have been increases in H5N6 detections in China, and some H9s as well. So those things are being monitored as well. But there's something we really do have to keep an eye on in case, say, because there's so much virus, the opportunity for changing is there, just like we see with COVID, a new variant, a different mechanism, but nonetheless, you know, those changes gives opportunity, right? So
Absolutely.
yes, be careful. Be careful, everyone. Protect yourselves.
And if you see a dead bird, don't touch it. Just call it in. Call the 1-866 number. Thank you again, Andrea, for joining us today. So essentially, we're going to remind you the CEZD report is there. You can sign up to get it. You can check out the website, cezd.ca, anytime. I find the report very quick and easy to read, to be honest. Those signals that you reported that are then filtered out to really be the ones that are applicable to us. It's just a quick touch base to see how prominent is it, where is it tracking, and what level of concern should I be even worrying about in the first place. So I do find it, although I don't want to look at the rabies reports,
No.
but I do check out the poultry reports. So thank you again.
Thanks very much.